Yakshamash. My name is Borat. I like you. I like sex. It's nice. This is my country of Kazakhstan. It locates between Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and assholes Uzbekistan. This is my town of Kusak. This is Orkin, the town rapist. Naughty, naughty.
What did you cut that you wish you could have kept in, but maybe didn't service the story?
Oh, goodness. I mean, there's so many scenes. I haven't really thought about the scenes that I haven't used in so long. But the scene I do remember, we did some really grand scenes. Like, first of all, like the Southern dinner scene where he comes downstairs with the feces in the bag. We did that scene like 3-4 times. So there's like 3 or 4 different versions of that scene. And a lot of scenes were like that, where we weren't quite satisfied with how it came out the first time, but you had to like go to a different city to do it again because the police now knew you were in town. And if we started up again, the police would show up immediately. So we would have to go to another town and set that all up again and do that all over again. So there are multiple versions of quite a few of the scenes that are in the movie. And then there were scenes like we did, there was a Civil War enactment with, I don't know, like 1,000 people in it. And Borat, he doesn't know in the movie, the premise is he doesn't know the Civil War is over. And so he's fighting in the Civil War. He played one of I can't remember the Union or the rebels, but, and he's like raping the dead soldiers and stuff because that's what they do in Kazakhstan.
Yes, that is Larry Charles, director of Borat, Brüno, Curb Your Enthusiasm, Emmy Award-winning writer for Seinfeld. And you've tuned into another episode of Comedy History 101, where we school you in comedy. I am Harmon, and a hearty hello. Today, this very day, you are in for a treat because Larry has worked on some of the most iconic comedy projects over the last few decades and has worked with such notable comedy legends as Larry David, Andy Kaufman, Jerry Seinfeld, Sacha Baron Cohen. He directed 3 Sacha Baron Cohen movies. And you are going to get some serious comedy inside baseball on the inner workings of the entertainment industry and comedy at large. And Larry also has a new book out called Comedy Samurai, 40 Years of Blood, Guts, and Laughter. And spoiler alert, it's a great read. So we'll also be talking about Larry's brand spanking new book. But before we jump into the episode, a quick plug. On Tuesday, July 15th, 8:30 at Pete's Candy Store in Brooklyn, I wrote a play, and I'm in the play. It's called The Roast of Graham Parsons, a dark musical comedy featuring the most debauched story in rock and roll history. And you can find out all about the show and my tour dates on my site, harmonleon.com, or on social media at harmonleon. Also, support Comedy History 101. Why not give us 5 stars on iTunes? Drop a comment. Share an episode with a friend. And you could do that wherever you find your podcasts or on our site, comedyhistory101.com, or on the social medias at comedyhist101. And enough of me babbling on. This is a great episode. I really enjoyed this conversation. And without further ado,
You're stupid. Everybody's so stupid.
I'm trying to use the phone!
Excuse me! Comedy History 101.
You can hear me okay?
Yeah. How about you? Can you hear me okay?
Excellent, actually.
Good to hear. Just for FYI, I'm coming to you from Brooklyn.
Really, where?
Well, I'm in Williamsburg, but so did you grow up in Brighton?
Yes, I grew up right at the intersection of Brighton and Coney Island at the very end of Ocean Parkway.
Yeah, so like you said in your book, you grew up in Trump Village. Was that the village where Woody Guthrie grew up as well?
That's Seagate. First of all, let me just say it was not a village. It was called a village, but it was definitely not a village. It was a war zone. That would have been a more appropriate name. Woody Guthrie
Trump
lived.
War Zone?
Yeah, yeah, that would have been much more appropriate. Woody Guthrie lived in a place called Seagate, which was at the very end of Coney Island. If you drove through Coney Island and you got to the end, there was a little community right on the ocean there that was kind of nice, actually, called Seagate. And it's very Hasidic now, I believe.
Yeah, and so then that's where he wrote a song about Fred Trump and his dubiousness in the 1940s, 50s, whatever.
Right.
How did that like shape your comedy just growing up in Trump War Zone?
Very deeply, really. I think my sense of the absurd, my sense of dark comedy really were very much developed in the playgrounds and parks and streets around Trump Village. There was, again, it was built along with a number of other housing projects, low-income housing projects at the same time. So Trump had 7 buildings, but there were like 3, 4, 5, 6 other projects that also had 3 or 4 or 5 buildings. So you can imagine, and they all were built at the same time. So everybody moved in at the same time. So you had this demographic explosion, especially as far as I could tell, with boys of a certain age, all moved in at the certain time, third grade, fourth grade, fifth grade, sixth grade. And so it was like a Lord of the Flies situation. There were just so many boys, and it had this kind of prison yard kind of, pecking order thing. There was a hierarchy. I often say, I think I said in the book, the bully to victim ratio was 1-to-1. It was really a challenge to survive each day there because you were under siege. Any weakness that you had would be exploited, and everybody, a lot of kids had weaknesses, not just like being weak or not being good in sports, although that could be enough to make you a target. I happened to be pretty good in sports, so I avoided that. And I was tall also, so I avoided some violence. But there were a lot of short kids. There were a lot of kids who weren't good in sports. There were a lot of mentally challenged children in this neighborhood who were, mocked mercilessly. Or if your parents had an accent, like they were from the old country, you would be mocked for that, So there was nothing. My parents were one of the first parents that got divorced in that neighborhood. So there was no escaping there were parents who were dead, and that would be taken advantage of, just like in a softball game or a slapball game or punchball game. You would get into arguments, kids would get into arguments. If their parents were dead, it would be used against them in the argument in the game. So there was no mercy and a lot of cruelty. And I witnessed a lot of it. I observed a lot of it and used humor to sort of survive it myself, to avoid being a target, and also to process all the horror that I was seeing.
Was it the Nines? Was that the game on the street? It's almost like a Yo Mama off.
What was it called?
I probably butchered it and got it wrong, but I think it's called the Nines, maybe.
Oh, yeah. Well, that wasn't. There was no formal version. I think you're talking about like the Dozens. Also, it was
the
called.
Dozens. Sorry, I knew there was a number involved.
That's okay. But I mean, in my neighborhood, it was just people continually verbally assaulting each other and insulting each other. But it would also take the form of physical assault as well. And then some kids really were just under physical assault. And I don't, again, to me, I always heard stories about even sexual assault, although I didn't witness that myself. So it was pretty rough, actually. And different kids have different memories of that, but I was an observer from a very early age and a detached, as much as I could be detached, observer of what was going on and made mental note of it because I didn't want to get, caught up in it if I could avoid it.
Which, again, it's like going forward to say, working on Borat and Brüno, where you're in dicey situations, it's detaching and making mental note.
Well, also learning how to verbally sidestep trouble. Like I got very good at like talking my way out of trouble. If I like turned a corner, sometimes there was this one year in like 69 or something where there were a lot of gang fights in the park that we all hung out in. And I was like, I don't want any part of this. I don't need this. I was a young guy. I was often be mistaken for an older person because I was taller. And I got beat up a couple of times. And I was like, I don't want to be involved in this. And I would leave and try to head home and take a circuitous route. And sometimes I'd bump into the gang that was coming to the park to have a fight. And I'd have to talk my way out of it. And I got pretty good at that, as a survival technique. So that's something I was able to also apply to Borat and Brüno. I mean, I was in a weird way uniquely qualified to do those two movies.
And then I think it was on the Marin podcast. Your dad was a comedian.
My dad was a failed comedian, yeah. Although he was around, I probably would try to find a softer word for it. He in World War II, he was in the occupation forces at the very end of World War II, and he was a little bit younger than most of the people that fought. Like his brothers were war heroes, actually, but he was kind of he did not do well in the army, but he did do some stand up, and he really liked it a lot. So much that when he got out of the army, he used the GI Bill to go to drama school and started doing stand up, and his stage name was Psycho, the Exotic Neurotic, and he he worked for a while. I doubt he ever made any money. He was always very vague about that career, but he would be very specific about how he had an audition for the actor studio and he didn't make it, and he loved show business, and Jason Robards Jr., who I don't know if you know, he was a great actor in American movies and stage. He was his teacher at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts, and he stayed friendly with him, and he got to know Marlon Brando a little bit, and he was part of like an entourage of Brandos in the 50s when Brando was still strictly a stage actor. So he was enamored of all that. So even when he dropped out, he still was very consumed by show business.
And what comedy were you listening to back when you're being chased by gangs and being taller than everyone?
Well, I wasn't taller than everyone, but I was amongst the taller
You're
ones.
taller than the people that weren't as tall as you, is what I meant to
it's
say.
surprising. A lot of guys would be bullies, and then a couple of years, you get to like, in third grade they'd be a bully, but by fifth to sixth they hadn't grown, and I had, and so you had this kind of disparity in height and things like that. In life today, as adults, it shouldn't make that much of a difference, but as kids, it made a lot of difference. What your height was kind of saved you or made you a target. The kind of humor I was into humor, period. I loved cartoons. I loved, cartoons and magazines. I loved cartoons on TV. All that kind of stuff was very big to me. I watched virtually all the sitcoms I was allowed to watch until I had to go to bed. I remember particularly loving things like Get Smart, though, which, I didn't even know who Mel Brooks was at that time, but the gags were hard gags, and I like that. And then around sixth grade or so, I walked down Brighton Beach Avenue one day, and there was a couple of used bookstores there, which was nice, and a library too. And I had like a quarter, and I went into the bookstore and I bought a used version of a book I didn't know anything about, but I just looked at the back cover, a paperback, and it sounded interesting, and that was Catch 22. And when I read Catch 22, everything kind of came together because now all the darkness and the absurdity that I was feeling in the park, here's somebody, Joseph Heller, who was able to write about war and death and make it funny. and I realized, oh, that's a possibility, and so that really expanded my sensibility, that book, that single book.
I'm trying to use the phone!
Throughout the book, you talk about the comedy Samurai. For those who have yet to read your book, which they should, which is such a great inside baseball
Thank you.
into also just the inner workings of comedy and show business. How would you explain the code of the comedy Samurai?
Well, one aspect of it is the serving the master, and in my case, I was very lucky to sort of have like the ultimate masters. I mean, between Larry David and Jerry Seinfeld and Sacha Baron Cohen, you're not going to do better than serving those masters. And I also, worked with Bob Dylan, and so I had that luck. The other thing was I often came along like I did with Seinfeld, like I did with Borat, with a number of other projects. I came like Entourage even. I came along when these projects were actually in trouble. They were not succeeding, and I had a kind of unique insight into what I thought these shows and movies might need, and I was able to, like a samurai comes into a village that is under siege, and he saves the village, and that's kind of hyperbole, but that's the other samurai part, coming into the village, saving the village, and then moving on to the next village, never getting attached.
Yeah, and what I loved, just in the opening of the book is in 1976, you were in the Comedy Store. How did that work? Did people just like young comedians just go around the parking lot or the front of the Comedy Store with jokes in hand, and you sold like your first joke? Did Jay Leno?
I didn't see anybody else doing that. There was a lot of comedians in the Comedy Store. The parking lot was in the back, and so there was a kind of a status to having a car that was allowed into the back to park. If you weren't a customer, like Jay Leno was always allowed. He always had the classic cars, and he would be able to pull in and park in the back. Mostly, there was a big group of comedians and comedy wannabes hanging out in front of the Comedy Store. It was jammed every night pretty much, because every night something was going on. Monday was open night, a mic night, and there was always something going on. And I started hanging around there. Not that I made too many friends, but I thought I had these jokes. I was doing stand-up too, but I didn't really like my stand-up. I didn't feel like I was doing a good job. I didn't feel like I was being funny enough. I wasn't being myself enough. The best version of a comedian is his best version is on stage. And I could not bring that to the stage. I was too self-conscious, but I had good jokes. I had good material. And I would stand in front of the Comedy Store, and there were so many comedians, and I'd wait till I recognized the comedian, and then I would approach them with my handwritten yellow legal pages of jokes and say, hey, you want to buy a joke? And people were desperate for material, and they were open, and it didn't cost them very much. It was on consignment. They would go and try it out. If it got a laugh, then they would give me like $10.
Do you remember that first joke that you sold to Jay Leno?
I think, people have been asking me that, and I think if you go back to he's done it on the Tonight Show back in the day, and I think it was about Delta Airlines. They used to have a commercial where it's like Delta Airlines, the airline run by professionals. What do they have on the other airlines? Amateurs? It was something like that. Not the greatest joke in the world, but enough for him to get a laugh at the Comedy Store and give me $10.
It's Friday! Starring Mark Wakefield, Larry David, Michael Richards.
The classic show Fridays, like it just seems like all roads start at Fridays, because that's where you met, obviously Larry David, and you met Michael Richards, and you even met Seinfeld, who was like in the bowels of the building as what was he like? What was his role? Like joke writer for Benson.
Keep it cheer. Frankie's here.
Frankie, what do you want?
I brought a letter over from Miss Krause, and I thought, since I was here,
You'd pitch a few jokes to the governor. Frankie, sit down.
But Benson...
Sit!
Yeah, he was the joke writer for the governor on Benson. Benson was the butler, basically, for the governor, and Jerry played a joke writer for the governor. And had a very small role, semi-recurring, and eventually was dropped from the show. So his beginnings in sitcoms were very inauspicious.
What were your encounters like with him when you meet him, like in that basement area? I think you
I
described in the
remember,
book.
yeah, it was like first of all, that basement was like a prison also. It was like a cinder block hallway with like with windowless offices, and so you would get bored being in your room in your cell, so you would come out and we played games in the hallway a lot of times. We would like throw quarters or throw a ball or whatever we could down there. It was weird, like being in a submarine or something. And sometimes, like I would just take a walk down the hallway, or I would be chasing after the ball or something like that. And way down the hallway were a couple of other rooms, and they were dressing rooms for Benson, I guess, but he was in one of those rooms, and I would walk by and I would see him sitting forlornly in his room all by himself, nothing to do, waiting for him to be called to go up and do his little bit in the show. And I had, a couple of very casual conversations with him where he was talking about, how this was not working out so well for him. And, again, in show business, you just never know, is that this may be the last time I ever see him. There's a lot of people that you meet along the way and they have their shot and nothing happens after that. That's the end. They get there, even if they star in a show, that could often be the end of their careers. And in his case, it seemed like, wow, he's not a star of the show. He's a very small role in the show, and he's going to get dropped. And he kind of knew it, and he eventually did get dropped. And I didn't hear about him for a while, but he actually wisely went back to stand-up and bolstered his stand-up until that became a legitimate thing for him.
It was the high watermark of working on Fridays, your Diner of the Living Dead sketch, where that evening you got to smoke spleefs with the Clash.
Well, that certainly, I had a few highlights, but that was I would say the first highlight, because that was on the third show.
Oh my God!
Diner of the Living Dead.
And I was frustrated because I could not get a sketch on the first two shows. And then I wrote a sketch, this Diner of the Living Dead, which I'm also in, by the way. I'm in the counter there eating flesh. And that was a very groundbreaking show for Fridays and for TV, so much so because we had Diner of the Living Dead, which the affiliates found horrifying. We had another sketch called Women Who Spit, which was like a talk show where women talk about mundane things and then they spit like guys. And then the Clash were on, who also spit when they were on. And so the show got dropped by a lot of affiliates after that, actually. And we were really proud of that. We thought, wow, we're having some impact. And impact has always been an important theme in my work, And so that was a highlight. Afterwards, we would have a party, an after-show party, and I got to smoke large spliffs that the Clash rolled, and it was great just hanging out with them. But fortunately, there were a few other highlights as well, because for me, there was still kind of heights to reach on that show. I was lucky.
Yeah, was that like you noted that, and it made me laugh just because it's so awful, is that like early on, like all the writers wanted to separate themselves from SNL, and that was like a big marker for you guys. And then you gave them like a series of titles for the show, and the networks came back with Fridays.
Yeah, that was like that was the first sign that we were working for a large corporation, that we were working for a network, that we were like all these young radicals who wanted to, I don't remember it all. I couldn't even begin to tell you. There were so many. We would all come in with like 10 titles. We were like, again, some of them weren't even words. Some were just signs or symbols like Prince, it was like just a sign. And we thought that would be really cool, So there were all kinds of alternatives, because we want very Monty Python-esque, a lot of the titles. And we wanted it to be something completely different, as Monty Python said. And we were really excited about that because we thought that's going to throw down the gauntlet. Here's a late night show that's not going to resemble Saturday Night Live at all. And then we came into the meeting and they had already made the binders and the jackets and the stationery. It all said Fridays. Even the font wasn't that interesting, you know? And we were all like, okay, in a way, we were extremely disappointed. And in another way, we redoubled our efforts to be as radical as we possibly could, to move as far away from Saturday Night Live as we could. But that was a hard battle.
And what was like your first encounter with Larry David? Do you remember like that sort of first conversation, or what really struck you? And he, as you mentioned, another mentor in your life.
Yeah, I mean, he was he was probably my main mentor in my adult life. At the first writers' meeting, he was a writer. He and Michael Richards were both writers as well as actors. So they were in the first writers' meeting, and Larry, I was like, I was new. I had been a bellhop and a parking valet before this, quite literally. And so I was like, starstruck, wide-eyed, just like couldn't believe I was there still. And there was a lot of other young guys, but they had a little more experience. I was the second youngest, and everybody else had a little more experience than me. And then I heard Larry David talk, and he talked like my friends in Brooklyn. And of course, he was from the same neighborhood, essentially. And so from there, he and I immediately connected. I mean, to know that there was somebody from the neighborhood there who was older than me and kind of knew the ropes a little bit, that was a great relief. And he was very generous and we became close friends almost immediately. And he became, as you say, a mentor who not only taught me, he taught me really, as I say, he taught me how to be a man, really. I mean, I was a kid, and he taught me about discipline, about craft, about integrity, because he was an uncompromising person. And I've carried that lesson with me my entire life, really.
And there's a classic Andy Kaufman, restaurant scene. Do you see that like where Andy Kaufman, just for explain to people, it looks like he's, just completely diving out of the sketch, but you said like everyone knew except maybe like a couple of the actors in the scene.
I feel stupid.
You feel stupid?
I feel very stupid. No, because where are you going?
Well, I don't know. I think I'm gonna.
Do you see that moment like as a predecessor to Borat, where you're kind of skewing people's perception of reality, or was that influential, that moment? Because like majority of people that see that clip, still think that Andy Kaufman would just kind of, hijack the scene.
Well, there was just, the Michael Richards was in the scene and he knew because he was in the writers' meeting where we came up with this. But the crew didn't know. And the audience didn't know, and the other actors didn't know. So most people involved with the scene did not know. And so they all had to kind of scramble and improvise on camera a little bit. Yes, Andy Kaufman, not just in that scene on Fridays, but in general, Andy Kaufman was a very influential person for me. He was a philosopher of comedy. He was constantly trying to figure out what was beyond the laugh, what would happen when you had an audience. He was a performance artist, really, only he did his performance art in front of paying crowds and nightclubs and things like that, which is very much more courageous in a way than doing it in an art gallery where people kind of expect it,
Or Jerry's Deli.
Or Jerry's Deli, yes, exactly. So he was a very one-of-a-kind, completely unique, completely original anti-comedian in a way, anti-comedy person. And because he could get laughs if he wanted to. He was very skilled. He was a great impressionist. He could do a lot of things and he could get laughs if he wanted to, but he really was more interested in what would happen if you didn't get a laugh. And so that was very important to influence on me. And as far as Borat goes, yes, there's no question there's a connection, but Sasha wasn't really that aware of it. I mean, I was, having worked with Andy a little bit and having seen his other stuff, but Sasha, coming from England, was not that aware of it. He almost came up with his version of that on his own in England, and it happened that it overlapped to some degree with what Andy was doing. It was different though also. I mean, Andy never got the chance really to take it to the place that Sasha took it in movies like Borat.
You're stupid. Everybody's so stupid.
When you started on Seinfeld, I loved how you mentioned that you were the George Harrison of the show.
Right. Well, because I had John and Paul, Jerry and Larry were like John and Paul. They wrote all the songs and they were great songs. I mean, how could you argue with that, And so I had to find my way. I had to find my place and get that one song on once in a while. And I was able to do that. And those were good songs too. They just weren't as many, obviously. And I don't think I could have done as many as Jerry and Larry did. Jerry and Larry were Seinfeld, and for me, I was always like sort of scrambling sort of on the outside to try to find my way in.
And then what you described you brought to it was like a Bukowski, Harvey Pekar sort of element to the characters. So that would really sort of define, the episodes which you wrote.
Well, I would say I wouldn't go that far. I would go that far, but I would also add my influences, as we talked a little bit about them before, but things like Dragnet, Superman, Abbott and Costello, the kind of comedy that I was really attracted to, the more cartoonish visual comedy that I was able to incorporate with Kramer. Those were things I also brought to it. There was a working class element to the original Seinfeld. Everybody was struggling a lot more. You didn't know where their money came from. George was always desperate for a job. Elaine was kind of struggling just to get by. Kramer was the fun of Kramer was, how does he pay the rent? And how do these guys live? And Jerry always seemed a little more successful than they did, but he was supposed to be a struggling comedian also. So I thought that I related to, because I had always struggled.
This guy really smells. Doesn't anyone use deodorant in the city? What is so hard? You take the cap off, you roll it on. What's that? I feel something rubbing against me. These disgusting animals. These people should be in a cage. We are in a cage. What if I miss the wedding? I got the ring. What do? You can't get married without a ring. Oh, I can't breathe. I feel faint. Okay, take it easy. It'll start moving soon. Think about people in concentration camps, what they went through. And the hostages. What would you do if you were a hostage? Think about that. This is nothing. No, it's not nothing. It's something. It's a nightmare. Help me. Move it. Come on, move this.
But as the show got more and more successful and more writers came in who came from better backgrounds than me, or not better, but more affluent backgrounds with intact families and more successful fathers and, better private school educations, the show inevitably used those elements, and so people suddenly had good apartments and good jobs. And I related to that less as time went on, but that took a while. So the original first couple of seasons of the show, you see the characters struggling a lot more. They're sort of underground characters a little bit, like you see in an underground comic like Harvey Pekar, or you see in stories by Charles Bukowski or people like that. Yes.
Yeah, and Elaine wasn't even in the pilot episode, was
Right.
she? Is that true?
I don't think she was. No, they had a waitress who was going to be the semi-regular, because they were in the coffee shop so much. But she would just come in, take the order, make a couple of quips, and then go off on her merry way. And it wasn't very satisfying. And they wanted a more substantial female character.
And then I enjoyed how you said it's not a show about nothing, it's a show about nothingness, which, stems more Samuel Beckett in its premise. In dangerous comedy, you said when you would go to these countries, the one thing all the people in the market would be selling is Seinfeld bootleg DVDs.
Yeah, well, in places like Jordan, we were doing Brüno. I would walk down the street in Amman, and there would be the street sellers on their blankets, which you see in almost every country, including, the village in New York. But in Amman, for instance, you would see a bootleg on that blanket on the ground. You would see a bootleg copy of Seinfeld, a bootleg copy of Borat, ironically, and then always a book, a copy of Mein Kampf. It would be those three things. And
What do you think the connection between the three are?
I think that people thought Seinfeld. I think that people thought Seinfeld and Borat were hilariously funny and transcended ethnicity, and there's still kind of lingering anti-Semitism, and so thus Mein Kampf. It's a juxtaposition, and yet in some way in my mind it kind of all fit together.
And also, is there footage? What I enjoyed is you were doing as much infiltration and character playing on Borat as Sacha, almost just set up of like going, I don't know this guy, I just met him today,
Right.
and all that backstory. Is there footage of that?
I don't know. There's a lot of footage.
I would love to see that footage. That to me is as that has its own level of interesting.
The original assembly
preamble.
of the movie was 6 hours long, and also besides that, Ruben Fleischer, a really good director in his own right, when he was first starting out, he was hired to kind of follow us and shoot it behind the scenes. All that stuff exists somewhere. I've never, I've seen the 6-hour version. Obviously, I cut it. But the stuff that Ruben shot, I've never seen really, and so I don't know what exists, what doesn't. It was kind of, again, performance art, and it wasn't really meant for the camera or to be in front of the camera. So a lot of times the camera was not rolling while we were doing this kind of setting up the alternate reality, which is what I would call it, And so the camera would not be rolling during that time most of the time, but I'm sure it was caught here and there. But it was a performance for sure. Not just me. I mean, I was kind of like the lead performance in those setup situations, but the cameraman had to play along. Everybody who was in our group had to be part of this little play that we were doing before the scene started.
And what did you cut that you wish you could have kept in, but maybe didn't service the story?
Oh, goodness. I mean, there's so many scenes. I haven't really thought about the scenes that I haven't used in so long. But the scene I do remember, we did some really grand scenes. Like, first of all, like the Southern dinner scene where he comes downstairs with the feces in the bag.
I feel much better. Cindy, where shall I put this?
Just,
Where shall I put this?
maybe in the other restroom down
In
here.
excuse me for just a moment, please. You roll off like this, and you wipe your bottom, and you put the paper. Look, I don't. You do. This is a very private thing.
The host cleans the anus of the other?
No. Nobody touches you.
We did that scene like 3-4 times. So there's like 3 or 4 different versions of that scene. And a lot of scenes were like that, where we weren't quite satisfied with how it came out the first time, but you had to like go to a different city to do it again because the police now knew you were in town. And if we started up again, the police would show up immediately. So we would have to go to another town and set that all up again and do that all over again. So there are multiple versions of quite a few of the scenes that are in the movie. And then there were scenes like we did, there was a Civil War enactment with, I don't know, like 1,000 people in it. And Borat, he doesn't know in the movie, the premise is he doesn't know the Civil War is over. And so he's fighting in the Civil War. He played one of I can't remember the Union or the rebels, but, and he's like raping the dead soldiers and stuff because that's what they do in Kazakhstan. So that was a really amazing scene. And then there's a scene on a plantation because there's actual plantations in the South where they do tours of like what it was like in the grand old days of, before the Civil War. And they had, black kids playing slaves out in the cotton fields and the mistress with her hoop skirt and all that kind of stuff. And that was an amazing breakdown. The scene didn't last very long, but what happened in the breakdown of the scene was amazing. And that was one of our biggest police incidents. And most of that is on camera also somewhere. So I don't know what happened to most of that. I don't have any connection to that footage anymore. That's like Fox owns that footage or Sasha has it or something. So I don't have access to it.
And what did you film that just didn't work and maybe just came out really, really just dark in an unfunny way?
Well, like in the plantation scene, he's supposed to, again, not know that the Civil War is over, and he's going to come and free the slaves that are in the cotton field. So he drives up onto the field with the ice cream truck and jumps out of the ice cream truck and immediately starts kind of confronting the mistress of the house. And he was a little aggressive that day, which sometimes happened. And to me, it was hilarious. But he was like, well, she had this big plastic horse, for instance, a life-size, kind of rendition of a horse that was plastic. And he was saying, you put curse on horse, gypsy. Do not put curse on me. Why do you put curse on horse? Do not put curse on me. And he started to like freak her out a little bit. And she immediately was like looking at me behind the camera going, what's going on here? And no matter how much I tried to keep her in the scene, which I had to do a lot also, because people would go, is this real? Is this real? And I would go, yes, it's real, but I wouldn't tell them that it's not the reality they think it is. She just immediately called for her husband and they called the police. And the scene broke down almost immediately. And we all had to basically run and get Sasha out across the state line because he was there on a visa and he would be deported potentially if he got arrested. So he was always whisked away immediately. And then we followed, but we got caught by the police and brought back to the scene and had to work it out.
And then, like, say on Brüno, you talk about like going into like you had a white supremacist scene. And then suddenly he showed you his Nazi altar. And like, I've done like some undercover stuff where you like with those moments, you feel almost like elated, or I don't know if that's the correct word, because that's going to make great footage.
Yeah. I mean,
take away that there's a guy with a Nazi altar.
Yeah, no, I was very focused on what's best for the movie. That's all I cared about. So yes, we walked into a few houses that had Nazi stuff inside of them on the walls and on their bookshelves and things like that. And I confess, I would get excited when I saw that stuff because that's exactly what, you wanted to get those visuals to sort of sell the idea. This is real. This is not some like made up Nazi or made up white supremacist. This is a real person living next door to you, possibly. And for me, it was like the potential for the scene suddenly would explode in that moment. Like, oh, wow, I can't believe it. And sometimes we got the scene done like we did the version that you see in Brüno, but there was like 2 other versions of that scene that didn't make it, that also there was Nazi memorabilia in the house, and people, and behind closed doors, there's a lot of weird stuff going on in America.
You say like Brüno or Borat was about love and Brüno was about hate in a way.
Well,
Borat, the underbelly of America.
Yes, much more brought to the surface. Borat, despite the fact that he was an anti-Semite, despite the fact that he was a rapist and incestuous and all these things, there was a certain innocence that was projected from Sacha's portrayal of Borat, which was brilliant. And it gave people a moment of hesitation to give him a little space to do his thing. And that's when the scenes really would take off because people were sort of patient with him and they were tolerant of him. When we did Brüno, much to our surprise, people had no patience or tolerance whatsoever for a flamboyantly gay character.
What's up? I'm Brüno. I'm
Herr Milan Fashion Week.
I'm going to wear the jumpsuit made entirely out of Velcro.
And so immediately, as soon as he walked into a room, people got hostile, and people sometimes very quickly got physical also. So it was you really saw, as much as you saw people sort of love Borat, and even the audiences loved Borat, they did not feel the same way about Brüno. Even though Brüno in many ways could be even a funnier movie at times, people just did not feel that way about Brüno. It brought out people's hate and people's anger, and it tapped into that vein of America. And as we know, that's the vein that we sort of see playing itself out still to this day.
Yeah, and what was the writing process in regard to like the structuring of like individual, gags within in each of the movies? Would you like predict like certain outcomes, and then it would be like kind of almost like a choose your own adventure with, directions to take, certain scenarios?
There was an enormous amount of writing. We had 3 or 4 writers with us at all times. Every night after, first of all day long while we were shooting, they were writing. And then after we wrapped, we would come back to the hotel. We would sit with the writers, Sacha and I, and we would go over what they were working on, and we would adjust it and change our needs based on how we did that day. So it was almost like writing a newspaper, because every day required like new writing and to stay ahead of it. So there was a master script of what we wanted to accomplish. Like in Borat, we knew that he had to go to California to go after Pam Anderson. Like that was kind of like a preset, but in order for the story to work, we had to like plant certain pieces of information in certain scenes, certain story points that Sacha would have to manipulate the conversation to get the other person to go, oh, Pam Anderson lives in California. And then he'd be able to go to the next scene. So there was a lot of plot, seeding of the plot in the writing. And then there were like the gags themselves, which would mostly be, like you said, predictive. They would write questions, and he would then put the questions in his what looked like a translation book, but really had the questions in them, and so he could refer to that if he needed to. If he would pretend he didn't know a word, and he could look at and see what the questions would be, and from scene to scene, like I was saying about the Southern dinner, those things got punched up and over the course of the versions that we did. So the first version maybe wasn't as strong joke-wise as like the last version that's actually in the movie, because we kept pumping it and going, we need this, we need that, we need something here. And the writers would work on that. And then we would it would then be, that would be kind of a guide. And then you had to let things go when you actually filmed it, because you didn't know, even though you tried to predict how they might react, and sometimes they did, they also sometimes were unpredictable, and you had to go with that. And sometimes that was better.
And then in the 3 movies, Borat, Brüno, and The Dictator, do you feel, I mean, you touched on this, that Sacha sort of took on the characteristics of each persona, like say, Borat's the innocent, Brüno a little self-absorbed, and well, the dictator's a dictator.
Yeah, I think there is truth to that. I mean, from at least my observation of it, as the director of those 3 movies, that's how I would sort of talk about the arc of his personality as we did these movies, because he was very, he was very green, as was I to some degree, in making Borat. So he was very open still to the collaboration and really seemed to appreciate that collaboration. By the time we got to Borat, again, he was under physical assault a lot of the time. It was very difficult. And he had to be sort of pampered a lot more, because Brüno needed to be more pampered than Borat did. And he was a little more controlling of things, or tried to be, in Brüno, but still had to relinquish a lot of control in order to get the movie properly. By the time we got to The Dictator, which was a scripted movie, just like any other movie, he was like he wanted to be in control of everything, and in doing that, he didn't pay enough attention, in my view, to his performance. That was the one thing I thought that suffered the most, was that he was lost he didn't really know the character the way he knew Brüno and Borat, and because he distracted himself a lot with the minutia of making a movie, which is important, but not so important for him. He needed to really kind of work on his accent, work on his body movements, and work on the character, get inside that character a little bit, like he had done with Borat and Brüno. He knew those characters inside and out, literally. He knew what kind of underwear they wore and all, to that degree. But with the Dictator, he was flailing a little bit more with the character, and in a way, to deal with the anxiety of not having that down, he would like get focused and distracted by other things like the color of the flag or what kind of gun he carried and stuff like that.
And then you mentioned like he also leaned heavily into, say, market testing, and would have a notebook in the back of the theater with kind of like jotting down numbers, like how gags would react with the audience. And you mentioned like, he just kind of lost his own comedy instincts and like left that to the masses.
Yeah. In Borat, it was clear to me the audience had no idea. They weren't thinking, God, I'd like to see a movie like Borat. They didn't know that Borat existed until they saw it. We gave them what they needed, not what they wanted. And they were pleased. The audiences were pleased to be that surprised by something, And what happened was he kind of fell off of that formula of surprising the audience, and instead let the audience dictate to him what they thought was funny. And they did not have a good set. They were not writers. They were audience, and they did not have a good sense of what was funny or what it takes to make something funny. So he would take all the entire movie and like break it down into the jokes and give it to the PAs, the production assistants, and they would fan out around the screening audience and listen to the laughs and give them grades. He would literally grade the laughs, but it was a bad system. It was pseudoscience because you weren't taking into account that maybe the setup was wrong, or maybe it was cut incorrectly, or maybe the joke itself just needed to be tweaked, or maybe they didn't hear the joke because they were laughing from the joke before. There were so many other factors that went into what made that movie work than just the joke itself. Like isolating a joke really kind of made you lose the big picture, literally in this case.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's like about set pieces and scenes, and a lesser laugh could have a bigger payoff at the end of a scene, or
Yes.
feed into something else.
Or character stuff. And also another thing was vibe. There's a vibe in a movie, and like if you capture the audience early on, they're in for the ride with you. They'll take that ride because they're feeling that vibe, and they want to just kind of roll with that, and they're like, as a mass, they are reacting to this kind of vibe in the movie, which Borat had in abundance right from the beginning, right from the opening credits. The audience was just like rolling with laughter, and it never stopped. It was a great roller coaster ride. And I think that you can't quantify that vibe. That is the X factor that some movies, whether they're dramas or horror movies or comedies, some movies capture that vibe and they sort of transcend the movie itself in a way. And Borat did that. And I think trying to figure out the formula for that led us astray to some degree.
Yeah, and just a few last questions here. I think what I went on your YouTube channel, and I think and you touched on this in the book, like kind of sums up your artistic journey of just always wanting to create and do new things. And like what you said is you didn't become an artist for like financial stability or something to that effect. And I just found fascinating your on YouTube your short I Can't Go On, which about the
Yes.
comedian.
Yeah, well, that guy, Adam, was like he was my Fagin in high school. I mean, he basically, like Dickens, he like taught me how to be a comedian and how to survive on the streets. And we spent a lot of time doing both, and he was as I say in the movie, he was a criminal, a crackhead, and a comedian. And he was a great comedian, but he had so many demons that he could not possibly overcome them as much as he tried in the course of his lifetime. And it ended in tragedy in his case.
And then what did you learn from Borat that you brought to dangerous comedy, which I really enjoyed and found fascinating?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm very proud of Dangerous Comedy.
You make a living as a comic in Iraq, helping people forget they live in a war zone. How do you break into comedy in Somalia?
No, Google it. Please Google it.
Risking their lives just to make people laugh.
You said that. I didn't say that.
Comedians and actors and TV and filmmakers who make comedy in places where it doesn't belong.
Get people to laugh just a little about that which might be the most sacred, and we might get them to open up a little bit.
I think there were things that I wanted to do that I had learned from doing Borat and things that I didn't want to do. I didn't want to deceive anybody. I wanted to be very straight and honest and just go talk to people as they were, as I was, and not try to fool anybody. That was important because to get access in places like Nigeria or Somalia, I didn't want to fool people. I was so appreciative of being allowed into these places and to get a chance to talk to these people that I wanted to connect in a very genuine way. That was very important. But by the same token, for instance, something maybe a little smaller but had a big impact. Sacha, when I met Sacha, I had a long beard down to my stomach, and my hair was flowing at that time, if you could believe it. And I wore ratty, clothes with holes in it, rags really. And he had me trim my beard really nice, nicer than this, and put on a suit and tie and look respectable. And by doing that, I suddenly had access to all kinds of places that I wouldn't have normally. And dressing nicely for dangerous comedy also made people more comfortable, with my trying to gain access to certain things. And they thought, well, he belongs here somehow. And they would open doors for me and treat me with respect. And that was a very helpful thing because it helped me break the ice in these situations.
Yeah, and in these war zones, the tragedy would be if there would be no comedy in these places.
Yes, and I found, on doing Borat and Brüno and The Dictator too, because we shot in Spain and some other places, and then doing commercials. I did commercials in all kinds of countries. I found that's when I started discovering, wow, there are comedians everywhere we go. It's like in the most, kind of oppressive regimes in Islamic countries, there were always comedians. And that was kind of a revelation to me. And it was great to be able to expose that to an American audience.
Yeah, not to make this about me for a second, but I used to be a journalist for Vice, and around 2018, I went to Havana, Cuba, to do a story on the stand-up comedy scene, where in the States now we get the there's no free speech anymore from the anti-woke guys, where you see people doing comedy where there's literally no free speech, and how they circumvent it, and how they cleverly can still express their political opinions and traverse around that. And, they couldn't make Fidel jokes, but they would go, everyone would know Fidel's birthday. So they go, let me read the horoscope for, I'll just throw out a random date, October 12th. And then they would read, everyone would know it's about Fidel, and they would put their scathiness into that.
It forced people to be clever, and it also showed you the lack of stakes in American humor, because you could say anything and nothing.
And how much free speech we have, no matter what you say, we don't.
In Somalia, I met comedians whose best friends were assassinated because of the jokes they told, and that was, or they were under threat constantly. People were literally killed for their jokes. So the stakes were always much higher in these countries where free speech is under siege, and you're dealing with these repressive regimes. And you're right, they would come up with clever ways of making their statements without coming right out and saying it. And because they'd be pulled off the stage sometimes if somebody like, in Saudi Arabia, places like that, it was dangerous. One of the comedians I interviewed in Saudi Arabia was arrested right afterwards, actually, and his wife was one of the activists who was pushing for women to be able to drive, and he was called he was named he was known as the Seinfeld of Saudi Arabia, and he was a pretty middle of the road comedian, but he got arrested, and it was not unusual for these people to get arrested, almost be killed, but still they were committed to their art and continue doing it.
And what's making you laugh these days? What comedy are you really enjoying?
Well, I don't find that much. Like I feel like a lot of the comedy is very controlled and very politically correct, which I understand and I don't criticize, but it doesn't make me laugh out loud, I think the only place where I really still laugh out loud is either in something spontaneous, like, I hate to say it, but seeing somebody trip, and fall, that'll make me laugh. I think Mel Brooks said, when you fall, it's comedy. When I fall, it's tragedy. And, but also stand-up. Stand-up is a place, there are enough comedians doing stand-up now all over the place in different countries, but in America, there are some really strong stand-ups who are cutting through the nonsense a little bit and saying things, kind of going to the deeper places, and that stuff might make me laugh. And I also still laugh. I'll go on YouTube. If I really need to laugh, I know I want to laugh, I'll go on YouTube and watch Rodney Dangerfield or Don Rickles or people like that who could still surprise me and make me laugh, even though I've heard the routine so many times.
And what advice would you give to a young comedian today or your younger self in retrospect from your journey?
I think it's two things, really. One is trust your instincts. We're constantly being touted off our instincts and told, don't do that, don't do that. Trust your instincts and don't be afraid to fail. And that's the second part. Don't be afraid to fail. You need to fail. Failure is a crucial component of the equation of success. No one succeeds without failing. And so the idea of failing, what you can learn from failure is vast. And those are the two things. Trust your instincts and don't be afraid to fail. And you'll get to where you need to go, wherever that is. Don't have a preconceived, kind of a notion of where you should be. Just let yourself follow that path and see where it takes you.
And, just because this is Comedy History 101, where would you like to see your place in comedy history?
Well, I don't really worry about legacy and stuff like that. I mean, I'll be gone at some point and I'll have no control over what people are going to say or do, or whether, comedy has a kind of it's hard for comedy to have a lasting value. I look today, I talk to young people and I'll mention people like Jack Benny and they don't know who it is. And Jack Benny was a global star when I was a kid, So I don't put much stock in legacies. People forget and things go on. Very little will be remembered, really. And, you could talk about Shakespeare or Bob Dylan, but you are hard pressed to point to too many people that we'll be studying and talking about in 100 years. So I don't worry about that too much. I mean, I guess I do worry about it a little bit, but I'm not obsessed with that. I just try to do great stuff and hope for the best.
Very cool. And where can people find the book?
The book is available. It's an ebook, it's an audiobook, and it's a hardcover. So really, virtually anywhere you turn, you should be able to get the book. I mean, you could get it online, like, the Amazon type places, and you could get it in any bookstore. It should be in every bookstore at this point. And if you are somebody who rather listen to it in the car, there's an audiobook that I read. And that's a lot of people seem to enjoy that because it's my voice and, it's like a big monologue basically. And so there's a lot of choices. It's out there everywhere. So it's available.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed the book. Great talking to you.
Oh, it's great to talk to you too, man. Great to meet you. Thank you so much.
And with that, we wrap up today's episode. And I really enjoyed that conversation and just hearing about, my God, those are some of my favorite comedy projects, films, TV shows of all time. And it was such a treat and a pleasure to talk to Larry Charles. And a big shout out to my friend Jean-Francois Bresson, who was the associate producer on today's episode and gave me the heads up to contact Larry Charles. And the quick plugs: Tuesday, July 15th, 8:30 at Pete's Candy Store. Come out and see my play, The Roast of Graham Parsons, a dark musical comedy featuring the music of Graham Parsons. I play the role of his tour manager, Phil Kaufman. And you can find out all about the show and my tour dates on my site, harmonleon.com, or on social media at harmonleon. Also, support our show by giving us 5 stars on iTunes. Drop a comment. Share an episode with a friend. And you can do all that wherever you get your podcasts or on our site, comedyhistory101.com, or on the social medias at comedyhist101. And until next time, bye.
You're stupid. Everybody's so stupid.
I'm trying to use the phone!
Comedy History 101.